Number 10. Rabbit test. In 1927, two German gynecologists developed the rabbit test. The test consisted of injecting the woman's urine into a female rabbit. The rabbit was then examined over the next couple of days. If the rabbit's ovaries responded to the female's urine, then it was determined that HCG was present and the woman was pregnant. The test was a successful innovation and it accurately detected pregnancy. The rabbit test was widely used from the 1930s to 1950s. All rabbits that were used in the program had to be surgically operated on and were killed. Number 9. Wife selling. During medieval times, women were completely underlimbed to their husbands. After marriage, the husband and wife became one legal entity, a legal status known as coverture. During this time in history, married women could not own property in their own right, and were indeed, themselves the property of their husbands. It is unclear when the ritualized custom of selling a wife by public auction first began, but written records indicate it was sometime towards the end of the 17th century. In most reports, the sale was announced in advance, perhaps by advertisement in a local newspaper. Number 8. Lobotomy. In 1935, Portuguese neurologist Antonio Moniz introduced a procedure called the lobotomy. The lobotomy consisted of cutting the connections to and from the anterior part of the frontal lobes of the brain. The procedure involved drilling holes into the patient's head and destroying tissues surrounding the frontal lobe. Moniz conducted scientific trials and reported significant behavior changes in patients suffering from depression, schizophrenia, panic disorders and mania. This may have something to do with the fact that the patient was now suffering from a mental illness and brain damage. Despite general recognition of the frequent and serious side effects, the lobotomy expanded and became a mainstream procedure all over the world. In 1949, Moniz was awarded the Nobel Prize. Number 7. Tobacco smoke enema. The tobacco smoke enema was a medical procedure that was widely used in Western medicine during the turn of the 19th century. The treatment included an insufflation of tobacco smoke into the patient's rectum by enema. The agricultural product of tobacco was recognized as a medicine soon after it was first imported from the New World. During this time, tobacco smoke was widely used by Western medical practitioners as a tool against many ailments. The idea to apply tobacco smoke with enema was a technique appropriated from the North American Indians. Number 6. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. During the 19th and 20th centuries, as the world's population began to expand, many industries experimented with a wide range of medicines. During this time in history, the scientific community conducted many trials with new drugs. New substances were often discovered that had a direct impact on the human brain. In some cases, international companies took advantage of the loose market standards and released potentially hazardous products. A good example of this is Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which was a medical formula compounded by Mrs. Charlotte Winslow, and first marketed in Bangor, Maine, in 1849. The product was advertised as likely to soothe any human or animal, and it was specifically targeted at quieting restless infants and small children. The formula's ingredients consisted of a large amount of morphine sulfate, powdered opium, sodium carbonate and aqua ammonia. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was widely used during the 19th century to calm wild children and help babies sleep. This cocktail of drugs worked immediately and slowed the children's heart rate down by giving them harmful depressants. During the early 20th century, the product began to gain a reputation for killing small babies. Number 5. Bloodletting. Bloodletting was one of the most enduring and popular medical practices in history, originated by the Greeks and used up until the 19th century for basically everything. In those days, the belief was the blood could be used up. It didn't circulate as we know it does today, but rather it would stagnate in certain parts of the body, causing illness. The other key belief was that the body contained 4 substances, called humors, which consisted of such things as blood, black bile, yellow bile and phlegm. An excess or shortage of any of these substances would result in illness. Number 4. Divine Right of Kings. The divine right of kings was a political and religious doctrine that asserted the demonic has ultimate authority over man, deriving its right to rule directly from the will of God. The law ensured that medieval kings were not responsible for the will of the people, but rather working under God's power. Number 3. Female hysteria. Female hysteria was a once common medical diagnosis, found exclusively in women, which is today no longer recognized as a disorder. The diagnosis and treatment of female hysteria was routine for hundreds of years in Western Europe and America. The disorder was widely discussed in the medical literature of the Victorian era. In 1859, a physician was noted for claiming that a quarter of all women suffered from hysteria. One American doctor wrote 75 pages of possible symptoms of the condition, and called the list incomplete. According to the document, almost any ailment could fit the diagnosis for female hysteria. Women considered to be suffering from hysteria exhibited a wide array of symptoms, including faintness, insomnia, fluid retention, heaviness in abdomen, muscle spasm, shortness of breath, irritability, loss of appetite for food or sex. For the treatment, the patients would undergo weekly pelvic massage. During these sessions, a doctor would manually stimulate the female's genitals until the patient experienced orgasms. Number 2. Drapetomania. Scientific racism is the act of using scientific findings to investigate the differences between the human races. In history, this type of research was conducted in order to suppress individuals. One example of scientific racism is a theory named drapetomania. Drapetomania was a supposed mental illness described by American physician Samuel Cartwright in 1851 that caused black slaves to flee captivity. Cartwright described the disorder as unknown to the medical authorities, although its diagnostic symptom, the fleeing of black slaves, was well known to planters and overseers. Cartwright delivered his findings in a paper before the Medical Association of Louisiana. The report was widely reprinted in the American colonies. He stated that the disorder was a consequence of masters who made themselves too familiar with slaves, treating them as equals. Number 1. Mercury as a cure. For centuries people believed that mercury could treat pretty much anything and everything. More than 100 years ago, if you didn't have enough shiny, silvery liquid running through your veins, you simply weren't considered healthy enough. Mercury, as we know, is highly toxic. Symptoms of mercury poisoning include chest pains, heart and lung problems, coughing, tremors, violent muscle spasms, psychotic reactions, delirium and hallucinations. Of course, people back then weren't aware of even half of these side effects, because if they were, they wouldn't keep trying to cure everything with it for over 1,000 years.